The other day, I got into a conversation on Twitter that was about digging holes in backyards and things like that. And it reminded me of a whole bunch of memories of stuff from my childhood. So we'll begin with the hole digging thing. There was something, and I don't remember the exact formulation, but like it was remarking about the masculine urge to dig holes, and that you have to be able to understand this in order to understand men, which is probably completely false, right? It's not a universal thing. However, there were quite a few of us in the neighborhood who did enjoy digging. And I remember, being interested in the possibility of digging a hole all the way from, our backyard to the center of the earth. And then, what would happen there? Well, it would get really hot and all of that. Fortunately, I never got more than a few feet down at that time. But when I was a bit older, we actually, and when I say we, I mean mostly me, and it was kind of a silly, obsessive project, dug a big hole, not in the backyard, but a little bit past it in the woods, because our property ended at the edge of a woods that was behind our house and a bunch of other people's houses and yards. So our subdivision on Glacier Pass, it was called the Hills of Delafield, and it took a long time for it to fill in. So it was mostly country and meadows and woods for a long time. There were a bunch of houses along Glacier Pass, and each had a 1 to 1.5 acre yard. So pretty big, right? Our house was in the middle of ours, so we had a front yard and a backyard. And the backyard kind of sloped down, and then the woods began, and the woods were big trees like oaks and stuff like that, and bushes, particularly things that we could cut our way through and make trails and stuff like that. There were also a lot of deer trails, and then it went uphill into this ridge line that was wooded, and then that descended, and then there was another big plot of land behind that eventually got turned into another subdivision. And so as kids, we used to play in that area all the time. We would go out in the woods, we'd sled, we'd make additional trails, we'd pick flowers, we'd play hide and go seek, spy on each other, all sorts of things. So anyway, I was probably, I want to say like in middle school or high school, we started digging. And we were like, yeah, we're going to make a big hole this time. And we actually dug out something that was about like 4 feet deep. And I want to say maybe even a little bit deeper, 8 or 9 feet square on each side. That's a lot of dirt, right? And we'd have to shore it up a little bit because otherwise it would kind of crumble in. And my mom, was like, what are you doing? Be like, I'm going out to dig. And I'd be gone for an hour or two. And she could look out there and see me. And she'd be like, well, I guess he's staying out of trouble. It's kind of a weird thing to do. And what we ended up doing with that big hole, and this was kind of our intention the entire time, was we used it to make a fort. Now, forts were kind of a big thing when I was a kid. And I don't mean the kind of forts that you see in cartoons where it's a tree fort and you climb up and it's very nice, like a tree house. These things were much more rudimentary, let's say, but they were ours. And we would spend a good bit of time making forts. And then, we would sometimes have battles or wars, and we'd throw rocks or clods of mud at each other's forts, and we'd use the forts as clubhouses. We actually did quite a few goofy things inside of these forts. I'll tell you about that in just a bit. And we would make these out of materials that we would typically find in different places. And so some of these forts could be very rudimentary, not very big at all. Some of them were actually quite extensive, but all of them were pretty ramshackle. So making this hole in the ground, we were going to have a partly above ground and partly underground fort. And we ended up lining the bottom of it with pallets, wooden pallets, which are things that you use for transporting heavy materials. So we got all of these from construction sites throughout the neighborhood and from other places as well where we'd find them. So a wooden pallet, also called a skid, there's other names for it, slang terms, is, you think of it as like 2x4s, so 2-inch by 4-inch things, and then they have like thinner boards nailed to them. And so, a pallet is about, this wide, square, and about like this thick. And there's, through the slats, you can see things. So it's not going to like totally stop the wind or anything like that, or snow or rain. But it's, it's kind of effective, and you can use it as a wall. You could use it as a floor. You could do other stuff with it. If you wanted to, like we did in the Army, you could break down pallets, take a crowbar and knock all the slats of wood off of it. So anyway, as kids, as the subdivision was being developed, people would build new houses. And the first thing that you do when you build a new house is the builders come in and they dig out the foundation and they pour a concrete basement, and it's cinder blocks and, concrete floor. And then you start building the house on top of it. And a lot of the construction materials are coming in on pallets. And so, they'll be like anchored to the pallet with like steel bands or stuff like that, and you snip them. So we'd actually find a lot of those things as well, and some other construction materials too, like piping and things like that. Much less useful for building forts. So these pallets, they were available, let's say, in abundance, because the construction people who were building the house, pallets are kind of junk, something they don't need, something they don't want. So they get whatever it is that they're shipping on the pallet, and they get that thing, which is what they really want, and then they throw the pallet anywhere they want to. And this was the 1970s and 1980s. So people were not as environmentally conscious back then. There wasn't recycling. You would just like find junk all over the place, right? So they're taking these pallets and essentially discarding them. We kids were mostly interested in getting these pallets, and so whenever there was like a construction site, we would sneak over there, usually after all the workmen had left. Sometimes we'd actually ask them, hey, can I have those pallets? And they'd be like, yeah, knock yourself out, kid. You're doing us a favor getting rid of those. But most of the time we thought what we were doing was kind of surreptitious, right? We're being kind of sneaky with it. And so we would steal these various bits of wood that we could then use, and we'd drag them, or we'd sometimes like put one on a skateboard and use that as a way to get it down the street, or we'd put it on our back, or two of us would carry it together. And so we'd have these things, and we'd take them out to the woods. And then after we had them, now we could actually build a fort. And the simplest kind of fort would basically be 3 pallets, one on each side, and then one in the back, and then one on top as the roof. So you'd need like 4 of them. And, we could easily get hammers, nails, things like that, bits of string to tie them together. Sometimes we would incorporate trees that were there, or bushes. Like you might, set up your pallets. You'd start cutting away at a bush, and then you'd stick the pallet down. So like part of the bush was sticking through the pallet, holding it in place. And we would just build these forts, right? So it was kind of a phenomenon, right? And we weren't the only ones to do it. other kids in the neighborhood would do it. And, sometimes you would steal other people's pallets and then they'd get all mad at you and you'd have like a rock or, mud throwing war with each other. And, you might incorporate other stuff. Like I mentioned tree branches. You might get some canvas and put it over your little fort that you'd made, or blankets, or, parents weren't usually cool with that because blankets could get rained on and ruined. But we would do all sorts of things like that, right? And we might find other boards. Sometimes there were rock piles where we could get rocks and use them as part of the fort as well. So there were lots of different designs, let's call them. But all of them were, and I used this word earlier, ramshackle. They were not up to any sort of code. They were just a bunch of kids using their imagination physically to make spaces that they could hang out in. And these were like our clubhouses. So, the girls would have their own forts, the boys would have their own forts. We would spy on each other. We would sometimes take over each other's forts. And it was, part of our neighborhood, but it was never in a yard. It was always out in the woods or in a meadow or something like that. So I mentioned I would talk a little bit about things that we did in these forts. And, they were things that we kids wanted to do by ourselves without the parents being out there. And some of this is going to sound kind of ridiculous. So back then, smoking was a big thing. Most of the adults that I knew smoked cigarettes, and we kids were told we shouldn't smoke cigarettes, but of course we were interested in doing that. So what we would do is we would actually get grass straw, dried, little, what would you call it, the trunks of the grass plants that were growing in abundance. And we'd get our hands on some matches or a lighter or something like that, and we'd smoke these little things. And they were terrible, right? But you could at least get like kind of a head rush doing that. We're very worried about our parents finding out that we were smoking. And so we would say things like, well, we were by a fire. Somebody lit the grass on fire. I don't think they believed us for a second. Another thing that we did was it had to do less with, we could say partying and much more with sexuality. So some of the kids had dads who would subscribe to magazines like Playboy or Penthouse. They would steal those. They would bring them out to the fort, and we would read through them and try to make sense out of what we were reading and seeing. And I think back to some of the conjectures that we had about how things actually worked back then and the slang that was being used, particularly in the cartoons. There were cartoons in these, and we're trying to make sense of it. And we'd be like, see, you can tell that she's excited because of this or that, And we were all full of crap. None of us knew anything. I mean, we were like in 4th and 5th grade when this is happening. But it was something that we would do together, and we'd conjecture about stuff like that. And probably the girls were doing something similar in their own forts. We don't really know because, we were in the boys' forts. And we would also swear a lot because, cursing was a bad thing. So saying words that you weren't supposed to say at home, we could say those in the fort because it was just us kids and nobody would know. So, lots of funny things like that we would do. It was, I guess you could say, it was like our little space to do what we thought were adult things, but do them as kids. And we would talk about all sorts of other things as well. We had a tape recorder sometimes that we would bring out, and we would listen to, Pink Floyd's The Wall was big at that time, so we'd listen to it and we'd try to figure out what the lyrics actually meant. Or we also listened a lot to Kiss. Somebody had a Kiss tape and we'd listen to that. And so that was part of the business as well. And this continued on throughout middle school. I think by high school, we really weren't into that anymore, building forts. But we did have that one where we were like, we're going to do it upright. And so we took a bunch of pallets and, we had a nice floor for the, in-ground part, and we built something over it. But then we kind of didn't do much with it. And it was, an interesting way to grow up. We did sometimes try to do, a tree house, but it was always like super half-assed, you could say. We would get a bunch of short boards and make steps going up into these oak trees. And a tree house was basically just a couple planks. We never actually built like an actual house with it. And we'd also do tents in the backyard. We would get blankets and, have we'd make a tent using string and sticks and stakes. And we were allowed to sleep out there at night in the summer. But then we had to take that down. Forts were a little bit more permanent, but they weren't really that permanent. And I think all of that just kind of disappeared as time went on. Those pallets were not really designed to stand up against the kind of weather that we have here in Wisconsin, particularly the cold, sleet, rainy, snowy winters. And so, they would kind of disintegrate over time. And I think all of that area has now been completely developed. So whatever traces there were of that from way, way back then, not 40-something years ago is all long gone, but it still exists here in my memory. And I thought I would share a little bit of that story with you because, it got awakened in my mind by thinking about digging holes, and then it tied in with all these other things that we used to do out in the woods as a way of occupying ourselves, a way of having something of our own, something private, something just for us, something where we could, be kids, but also figure out our way into maturing as adults. So perhaps you find this interesting. Perhaps you've had your own experiences like this as well. But there it is.